Hey, everybody, and welcome to the first session in our spring quarter series on entrepreneurship and Asian high-tech industries. I'm delighted to see everybody here. We're in a much bigger room than we usually are. So hopefully we will have even more people coming in than we usually do. Please invite your friends. And today I'm going to give an overview presentation for the entire course that will be sort of a 30,000-foot view of what's going on in the entrepreneurship ecosystems in Asia. I'm Richard Dasher. I direct the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center. We produce seminar series. This is not the very first seminar series that we produced, but we've been doing this one for over 20 years. And we have videos of a lot of the previous seminars that are available on the web, sometimes just for sheer kind of amusement. If you go back and see what we were saying about entrepreneurship 15 years ago, we'll see a lot of changes and some things that stay the same. This series continues every week, every Tuesday at this time until June the 4th. And you can look at our website, asia.stanford.edu, to see what's coming up and also access the videos and speaker slides from previous sessions. So it is a hybrid event. So the public is welcome either to come in person or to watch by Zoom. If you're going to come in person, please let Brianna know ahead of time so that we make sure we've got enough refreshments outside, because we are putting refreshments outside after the seminar is over. If you're a Stanford student, the university's expectation is that you will be here in person. So, I'll get into the credit requirements in just a minute. But the expectation is if you're taking this for credit, you should be here in person. Now, if you have some university-related reason for not being able to be here, send me an email. My email will be available in the next month or two. And something like being on a Stanford sports team or whatever, we'll waive the in-person requirement. Our contract with you, if you're taking the course for credit, is the syllabus. So make sure you download the syllabus from Canvas, or you can get an email copy from any of us up here. Obviously, to get credit, you register for the course. We're listed in 3 different departments. There are no requisites ahead of time. It's open to undergrads and grads in all majors and departments. And every year we have different content, a totally different series, even though it's the same theme every year. And so you can repeat it for credit in future years. The requirements: be here in person, and that means signing up the attendance sheet or whatever. And second requirement is to send a weekly email about the content of the session. For today, we have an incoming student and visitor survey, and we would love to find out from you how you heard about this series, as well as what you're interested in. Comments to me, I will be reading those for the rest of this week. So please do fill that out today. If you're a student taking the course for credit, that's the record of your attendance today. If you do need an accommodation to participate by Zoom or to participate asynchronously, send me a note, rdasher@stanford.edu. And for safety's sake, please CC our course assistant. Raise your hand.
Hi.
And comments should be sent to both of us too. Within 2 weeks of each session, about 60 or 90 words, something you learned by watching the session. More specifically, something that you could have learned only by watching the session, not just looking at the speaker slides up on the internet. Note, for this class, generative AI is not permitted. Basically, we want to know what you got from the session, and if you let generative AI tell you what you got from it, that's plagiarism. If your comment is deemed unacceptable, I will send you a note back and you can resubmit. I'll tell you what you need to do in order to get an acceptable comment. So today, for our introduction, just kind of a little bit on the place of Asia in the world, and then entrepreneurial activity and attitudes toward entrepreneurship in major Asia economies, then more on the ecosystem trends, especially venture capital trends in Asia. And hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. I should say that this session is recorded. We will put the video of this session up on our website, on our YouTube channel. And so if you're a student and you really want to make sure that you're not picked up, I don't think you can stop your voice being. But we do actually send this through Stanford Video to make sure that we don't accidentally violate somebody's privacy. So anyway, we do have some time for discussion at the end, I hope. So, the biggest economies in the world. 3 out of the top 5 are in Asia, right? This is measuring the gross domestic product of countries at what's called purchase power parity. This is what you can buy with a certain amount of money, right? So it's a very useful kind of comparison rather than the real exchange rates or the nominal exchange rates. The largest economy in the world is China and has been for the last 8 years. It's also continuing to grow rather rapidly if you look at purchase power parity. I have the next slide on growth rate. The actual stated growth rate is slower, but prices are not really increasing that much in China. Notice that China's GDP per person at PPP is about $21,000. America's GDP per person in the year 2022 was about $73,000. So if China approaches a level of production per person equivalent to the US, their economy will be 4 times as big. India is even more extreme. Even though it's a $12 trillion economy right now, the average GDP per person at PPP is about $8,400. So they have almost 9 times that they could grow to reach the current level of GDP per person in the United States. So there's an incredible amount of opportunity in Asia. Japan is there. South Korea is there. Indonesia is there. A lot of people don't realize how big the Indonesian economy is, $4 trillion at PPP. Thailand at PPP would be in the $1 trillion club, 1.5 trillion, but it's not there in terms of the exchange rate you can get in the bank, right? It's about $800 billion at that rate. So what's happening is that Asia is continuing to drive world economic growth ever since the days of COVID. So on this chart, the numbers that are in bold in blue are growth rates that are higher than the world average. So notice that it's really the emerging developing markets in Asia that on average are higher than the world average. Of those though, notice how China is on the low side, pulling down that emerging developing Asia model, and India is on the high side. So India is really emerging kind of out of the shadow of China. I put in Latin America and Caribbean just for comparison. Sub-Saharan Africa is pretty close to the world growth rate. So really the driver of world economic growth is Asia, particularly developing Asia. And if you go on and kind of see what people are worried about this year versus what they were worried about last year. Last year, everybody was talking about inflation. Now, all the news is about how inflation is moderating. It's becoming more stable. It's had a smaller impact on employment and on people's economic activity than was expected, which is another reason why interest rates are going to stay high. And people are getting kind of used to that, right? Despite the fact that it was a real shock last year. Geopolitical tensions were the big news back in 2023. Not a whole lot has changed, partly because we're coming up for an election this fall in the United States, but markets love stability, right? And climate change was also a big concern. And basically, it's being shoved out of the news by a lot of other news. Last year was the year when you saw a lot of reaction against the kind of inevitable inequality that happens when you have rapid innovation. The people who innovate, especially the successful entrepreneurs, become much more wealthy, and the rest of the population does not. So that increasing gap led to a lot of reaction against GAFA, right? Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon last year. You don't hear so much about that now. What you're really hearing about is everybody being worried about artificial intelligence, especially generative AI, right? I mean, this is the big news right now. And I think that this is the kind of backdrop to see what's happening in these different Asian economies. If you do have questions as I'm going along, feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to make sure I address them. We do have some time at the end though. So, okay, here we go. To talk about an ecosystem to support entrepreneurship, I'm going to use the model of an innovation system, where if you look at the process of innovation as knowledge, people, and capital flowing into a new combination, this is universal. It happens inside big companies. It happens through the creation of startup companies. It also continues to happen. New people keep flowing into the combination as a startup company grows. So this is a very useful way for us to think about what can go on in Asia. And I hope you'll remember this kind of slide because I can't cover all the data today. I'm giving you just, tip of the iceberg. But if you really want to keep looking at this or pay attention in the future, this is a very useful sort of framework to use. Where were the people who start a company? The biggest single pattern is that they were working in another company first. Once in a while, somebody will leave Stanford and start their company right away. But that's actually kind of unusual because the market timing is not usually timed to fit your graduation. And you've got to start your startup when the market timing is right. So really, people were either in a big company or they were in an earlier startup. But if they were just working in the startup, they may have left and then they're starting their own company as founders, or they're serial entrepreneurs. The money at the beginning of the company, you're going to put some of your own money into it if you're the entrepreneur. But most of the real money in the American model comes from angel investors. This is kind of a new idea in Asia where money has not been connected to innovation as much as it has been here. But I'm seeing the growth of an angel investor community in most of the big Asian markets. And this is one of the big changes in the last 10 or 15 years. Government is a source of money. Here in the US, SBIR grants, Small Business Innovation Research grants, will help you get a commercial product ready without having to fundraise from investors who have a tight clock wanting for you to start to get revenue. And in a lot of places, you have to take out a personal loan. This is one of those things that has been distinct about the Silicon Valley system more than other systems. Other less sophisticated systems, personal loans where you put your house up for mortgage or that kind of thing are much more common in other parts of the United States as well as in other countries. What are the knowledge? I separate knowledge from people. First of all, intellectual property is typically owned by the company you work for, not by you as a person. So if I invent something at Stanford, the first thing I have to do if I want to start a company around it is to go to Stanford and license the rights to my own invention. So knowledge is something that typically resides more in the organization, but in the person, one of the things that's distinctive about Silicon Valley is that whenever we see a problem, we look for the opportunity that it might bring. And that's one of the more fun parts of living in the Valley. That's to some extent, the whole process of design thinking was developed with that sort of opportunity identification in mind. So each one of these, you've got sources and you've got dynamics. On the people side, how mobile is the labor market? If there's no good job waiting for you if your current job fails, it's a much higher risk to go to work for a startup company. Social attitudes influence the flow of people. The perception of opportunity influences the flow of people. With regard to the flow of capital, supply and demand. We'll see in just a few minutes that in 2021, there was this huge spike of venture investing in startup companies that led to too high valuations. It was really wonderful if you're an entrepreneur. Well, guess what? 2022 and 2023 have not been nearly so good for the entrepreneurs. The power has shifted back to the investor side. And also, what kind of conditions on financing do you have to deal with? With regard to the dynamics for knowledge flow, you've got licensing practices. I have a lot of sympathy for university rights managers when it all first got started, because they thought their jobs were being measured by how much royalty they brought into the university, and that had a very negative effect. Stanford has been very successful because the Office of Technology Licensing here sees their function as, one, to support the research of the university with some extra money, but two, to kind of help people validate the usefulness of their research by really turning it into a social contribution. But the other thing that we'll talk a little bit about has to do with individual mentoring. How well is that established in a particular culture is another factor. And to make matters more complicated, this three-way movement into new combinations of people, really different people once you start the company. You can't get much anywhere if you can't hire people. And so the middle stage, the growth stage of the startup, is all about whether you can find people who are willing and capable to go to work in a high growth startup with very limited resources. Sure, if you'll give me an extra, $500,000, I can do a great advertising campaign. Guess what? In the startup company, you don't have that. You've got to figure out how to do it. And then at the exit, which is when the company is either bought by another company or it goes public on the public market. And so after a certain period of time, the earlier investors and the entrepreneurs and the people who have stock options can cash out. That's why it's called exit. They can cash their stock out. You really need the flexibility in the labor market for there to be good post-exit opportunities for the people in the startup. especially the kind of post-exit opportunities that will encourage people to go back and support the next generation of startups with the knowledge they acquired the first time. The first stage of starting up a company, you have angel funds, friend and family money. Really, it's at the growth stage that the venture capital funds come in. And in the Silicon Valley model, debt will start to come in a little bit, but mostly at the later stages of growth. And then what kind of IPO and M&A opportunities do you have? With regard to knowledge, you need some kinds of knowledge to start a company. You need new kinds of knowledge as the company is growing. Investor relations takes up a huge amount of time for entrepreneurs in growing companies. You need to be able to manage rapid growth and expansion. If you go too fast, the company falls apart. You can't sustain it. But if you go too slow, somebody else eats your lunch. And I think the big change at the time of exit is a shift in the mindset where now this company is owned by somebody else, whether it's a big company that bought you or whether it's the public market. Suddenly, you're working for somebody else, even if it's the company you founded. In Silicon Valley, typically founders have less than 20% of the company shares at the time of IPO. And the other big challenge is to develop ambidextrous management, meaning you have to preserve the value you've already created at the time you create new value. So instead of single products or single ideas that the company's formed around, now you've got a pipeline of possible new products that you have to manage. So these are the kind of things that sort of set the stage. Let's look at the people flow first. And for the people flow, I'm going to draw heavily from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which does a survey of something around 200,000 people every year using local teams in somewhere around 50 different countries. The teams are national teams. Tsinghua does the survey in China. There are 4 universities in Tokyo that do the survey in Japan. And it's really done pretty well. They do have half the survey that I don't pay attention to because it's basically asking experts what they think. And I don't think that's that useful for what we're trying to do. They've been doing this every year since 1999, and there's a great database on their website that I accessed this past weekend to try to get the most up-to-date information I could. What we'll be looking at is what they call total early stage entrepreneurial activity, or the T rate. And the T rate is composed of people who are in the process of starting a company and people who are running a company that has paid salaries for less than 3.5 years. So it will pick up traditional SMEs as well as Silicon Valley style startup companies. But this is what we're looking at. So if you look at the T rates of the big 4 economies, meaning the US and India and Japan and China, in terms of the size of the economy, over the last 12 years or so, you see a gradual increase in the US T rate. Now, there was a big drop between 2022 and 2023, probably because there was so much fewer investment, there was so much less investment money available. India has actually kind of trended upward. When you see a big jump between a couple of years, one does wonder if there was a kind of artifact in the way the survey was conducted, or it could just be something in the national news that made people react in a particular way and did not take the money that was available. For the last 10 years, the percentage of the working population engaged in early stage entrepreneurial activities has shrunk in China from a level that the US is at now, 15%, down to 6.8%. The Japan figures go up to 2022, and you see a gradual rise from 4% to 6.5%. And this is actually China, right? This was the last date that we had information from Japan, was 2022. That's the giant economies in Asia. Using the US as a point of reference, the tigers show kind of a different pattern. First of all of the tigers have lower entrepreneurship rates than the American model does. You have a kind of, gradual drop in Korea since about 2019. So the last 5 or 6 years, which is interesting because you don't get the feeling in Korea that things are negative. There, in regard to the entrepreneurship ecosystem, there is a lot of excitement and energy in that system. Taiwan has actually been tracking China, kind of, interestingly enough. Yeah, it's 5.6% is its last figure. But look at developing Asia now. The rates for developing Asia, with the exception of Malaysia, and we'll get into that in a minute, and I think this is Vietnam. Most of the time, the entrepreneurship rates have been higher than the entrepreneurship rate in the US. The entrepreneurship rate in Thailand, 24% of the working age population is actively engaged in starting up a company or running a new company. Others, I think the situation in Malaysia, if it was not an artifact in the kind of way that the survey was being done, then it had to do with some sort of a political external thing that really changed things around in the year 2017. I did not have a chance to go back and look at that, but it would be interesting to see if there's something there. So this is the T rates, people who are actually engaged in entrepreneurship. I do pay attention to attitudes that non-entrepreneurs express in this survey. They're fascinating. I don't think you can accept them as being as objective as whether the person is actually running a company or not. But they still give you some very interesting kind of insights. So in the United States, what we've had, with the exception of something between 2022 and 2023, was incredibly high sense of opportunities available for entrepreneurs. 65 or 70% of the people they surveyed, the 2,000 people that they surveyed in the United States, said that there were great opportunities for entrepreneurs in the US. The US also historically has a very high value on self-confidence. So around 50% of the people in the US think they have the skills to be an entrepreneur, right? The fear of failure is 44.6% now. It shows a gradual increase since, kind of this area around 2016, 2020. And I don't think it's enough of an increase to really try to look for reasons behind it. But this kind of keeps a lid on things, right? You don't start a company because you're afraid of what will happen if you fail. The T rate is the thick line, the gray line, and the black line is entrepreneurial intentions. This is people who say that they intend to start a company within the next 3 years. So in the US, the actual T rate and the intentions rate were almost the same until about 2017. And then gradually the actual T rate has started to exceed the kind of intentions rate. which may mean that less people are thinking that they themselves want to be entrepreneurs within the next few years. Maybe this is what happens during a time of economic uncertainty. But if you compare this to what's happening in India, this is incredible. 82% of the population think that they have the skills to be an entrepreneur, and also see great opportunities in the country for entrepreneurs. The big jump happened in 2018. Now notice that the fear of failure has also gone up. So if 82% of people see opportunities, 63% of the people are saying they don't want to start a company because they're afraid of what will happen if they fail. Maybe that's an indication of greater accumulation of wealth. If you don't have anything and there are no salaried jobs available, maybe you have no choice but to be an entrepreneur. And the survey does go to distinguish entrepreneurship of necessity versus entrepreneurship of opportunity. I didn't get into that, but I think that's likely to be a factor. Notice that the entrepreneurial intentions are noticeably higher than the actual T rate. So if that's the case, we're going to see more and more startup companies in India, especially, as we'll see in a few slides, the amount of venture capital has just gone through the roof. I mean, it's really increasing there. China. So there was a real jump up between 2018 and 2019 in terms of people seeing opportunities. 70% of the population sees good opportunities. 65% of the population think that they have the skills to be an entrepreneur. 55% of the population has fear of failure. Now, when you compare that to India, that's actually a lower fear of failure rate. But notice how the actual T rate has really been just declining. And the intentions rate was pretty high before COVID. But since COVID, the 2 years that they've been able to do the survey, it's right almost exactly the same response percentage as the actual T rate itself. So again, something is bothering people in China. Japan. For years, I've looked at this slide. I follow this survey every year. You can go back and see my previous presentations. It's just really sad that only 13% of the people in the population see entrepreneurship opportunities in Japan. And only 15% of the population think that they have the skills to be an entrepreneur. Now, those of you who know Japanese culture know that it's not popular to act like you're stuck up. You must be humble. And I do wonder if it's appropriate to say that, oh, I couldn't do it, you know. Meanwhile, I'm going to raise money and go out and try to do it. But the sad impact of this is that the actual T rate is not matched by the intentions rate in the last couple of years, which means that we're going to not see that many people becoming entrepreneurs. Go ahead.
Is there any systemic reason we have data missing here, or is it just?
Oh, those, okay. I should explain that. When they cannot get a legitimate sample of 2,000 people, they do not allow it to be reported. So that was the situation in Japan, as well as I'm sure everything was shut down in COVID. That's why we had the gap in China. Everything was shut down. They couldn't do the survey. But the same thing, India missed figures in 2012. The figures go all the way back to 1999. I figured they were not really interesting to put in those things. Great question, thank you. Do want to look a little bit at gender, and I will confess and say that this is year-old information. Notice how the percentage of women versus a percentage of men who are actually actively engaged in entrepreneurship is not really so different in India It's a little bit different in the US. It's actually more women than men in Indonesia. But when you get to the traditional East Asian economies, you start to see a much bigger gap, especially South Korea and Japan. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is a hot topic in these countries now. Hopefully, we will start to see changes. So how do you sum all this up? There are entrepreneurs in every society. They exist everywhere. One of the things you can't get from this survey data is who chooses to be an entrepreneur. Is this a great first choice, or is it what you do if you don't get the job with the big company that you really wanted to have? I think that the mid to late stage startups have more people problems in Asia than the startup do, because big companies still have a lot of prestige. And why would I go to work for somebody else's company unless I truly, really believe that this is the best way for success? Incentivization has not really developed as well. You get a lot of even founding teams in some Asian countries where there's one founder and everybody else is really an employee. And that's a kind of bad mood. The lack of mobility in some Asian countries is a factor, less so in China. And I think one of the big things that we'll talk about a little bit later is that entrepreneurs tend to stay with their company in Asia even after the exit. On the one hand, I can give you lots of examples of people who had to learn from bitter experience that running a big company is very different from starting up a company and running a startup. Think Steve Jobs, who got fired. But the big thing is that for the system, this reduces the number of serial entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs turned venture investors that contribute to the next generation of the system. So I'm hoping that Asia will start to see more kind of, people getting back into the system. It is happening. It's just taking some time. So that's the people side. Let's look at the capital flow. Here's our 2021 spike, right? This was just incredible amount of venture capital invested worldwide and an incredible amount of deals worldwide during the year 2021. Coming out of the COVID shutdown, people hadn't felt inflation yet. Interest rates were still low, so the financial side had money that was relatively easy for them to get. And everybody was in a hurry to be the first one on the block. And, then inflation kind of reared its ugly head. And 2022 was generally regarded as an awful slowdown. People notice movement more than they notice position. So the fact that it went down from this huge peak to a lot less during the year 2022 was a big factor. And there was a lot of things that people were worried about, right? The geopolitical concerns, invasion of Ukraine and things like that. Now, all the news reports that you see about venture capital is how the slowdown has moderated. It's still slowing down. And I'm seeing a lot of the word resilience showed up so many times when I did the study for today's lecture, meaning that the system is showing resilience, not that people need to have resilience. So as this happens, of course, you've got smaller deal sizes, and you do have an increase in what are called down rounds. So in the heyday of 2021, people were paying ridiculous amounts of money per share for the startup company. for companies that didn't have any revenue, no market validation. And the next time those companies had to raise money, guess what? In this kind of climate, the investors don't want to pay that much. So the price per share has dropped in about 11 to 12% of all of the venture capital rounds worldwide. That is the highest number in the last 10 years or so. In terms of percentage of down rounds. So that's happening. Asia is the big players in Asia are pretty much tracking the same thing. Worldwide, there were 60% fewer, or the 40% fewer. The amount of venture capital funding that was delivered in 2023 was 60% of that in 2022. Same thing if you're looking at Asia Pacific wide. The US, we held, only 2023 was 70% of what 2022 was. UK only 50%, and China was 70% of what it was in 2022. India was only 40% of what it was in 2022. So you are seeing this slowdown in all of the big economies. In ASEAN, you see the same kind of spike. So here is 2021. This is only, yearly. This is a first half year survey. This was the newest information I could get. And so the second half year had not yet showed up. And to be accurate, they kind of made sure that they pointed that out for both seed, Series A, Series B, and Series C plus rounds. But you see the sudden drop. South Korea, there's the drop again. Now, I want you to pay attention to the numbers. $8.4 billion of venture capital for a population that is about 50 million people and has a GDP somewhere around, 1.5 or $2 trillion at PPP. The reason I say that is because the very next slide is Japan, and Japan is an outlier. First of all, Japan started from a much smaller amount of venture capital 10 years ago and did not have a downturn in venture capital amounts funded, the total funding that went out, or the number of deals between 2022 and 2021. That's remarkable. The rest of the world is dropping like a rock, and Japan is not. Now, compared to the $8 billion that was invested in VC in Korea, Japan, which has an economy at least 2.5 times the size of Korea, had less venture capital in 2022. And so it has a lot of room to grow. That we do have to admit. But I think that we'll come and talk a little bit about why Japanese venture capital funding is showing this unusual kind of trend. In 2023, it did drop a little bit, okay? The 2022 numbers came down and really dropped even further. So what's going on? Let's look at India first. India is obviously attracting world attention as a possible place for manufacturing, supply chain hubs, as well as the growth of the middle class that has driven a lot of startup companies up to this point. Foreign investors, for a long time, played the biggest role in the India venture capital system. Something like 80 to 90% of the deals in venture capital in India included foreign VCs, and a lot of them included domestic VCs too. They were mixed. But as this has happened in recent years, you're seeing an increasingly mature, meaning sophisticated domestic VC industry in India. You're also seeing more billionaires in India. There are something like 43 billionaires who live in the Mumbai area. And so family offices are on the rise. And, I also have to say that some of the new government regulations are making things more difficult for foreign investors. It is not an easy country to do business. But by far the biggest drive is in the spending power of consumers. So between 2022 and 2023, and remember, India was declining in overall investment. The direct to consumer offline, online business, e-commerce business grew by 80%. And also you're seeing a lot of high-tech plays in India. Generative AI is a breakout theme, especially for consumer applications. We talk about our interest rates being high, they're even higher in India. And so, that's an issue. It's kind of keeping inflation down a little bit. But the last point about India is that which really dried up right after kind of the whole COVID thing, have bounced back. There were 1.7 times as many exits in 2023 as there were in 2022. And they generated $6.6 billion. But India only created 2 new unicorns in the year 2023. This is the unicorn farms in India, China, and the US, right? So last year, 2 unicorns were created in India, Zepto and Incred. 8 were created in China, 33 were created in the US. Notice that in the heyday of 2021, we created 300 plus new unicorns in the United States, and India generated 44 new unicorns. So what does this say? Especially if public markets are uncertain and a lot of people are acting like they don't want to go IPO on the public market until it's a little bit steadier, it shows that they're just not quite able to reach that $1 billion valuation. And that means that somehow growth, especially in the later stages of the startups, has taken the big brunt of the problems of coming out of COVID, even more than the seed stage. So if you look at China, the biggest thing going on in China is that it has to develop its own independent system, the decoupling from the US. And I'm not trying to blame the US or China, it's just a fact. US policy is making this happen, Chinese policy is making this happen. In 2021, when BD went public, they did not provide the information that a data-intensive company was supposed to provide to the Chinese government. And so the Chinese government launched an investigation after they went public on NASDAQ. During the time of the investigation, the government told them that they could not accept any new registrations or any application downloads. So basically, their possibility of growing was just shut down right away. They delisted off of the US exchange later that year. And the number of Chinese companies that are trying to list on an American stock exchange has dropped like a rock. Very few. So this also means that American investors used to love this pattern where you invest your money in China and then it comes back to you when they go public on the American exchange. You don't even have to worry about repatriation of the original investment, right? Your stocks go public in the US. That model has disappeared. And so, first of all, the Chinese venture capitalists have to look for different sources of investment money. They're going to the Middle East for limited partner investments. And they're also going to a lot of local governments that have some funds to invest in China. There's a strong preference in China now that investment should be in renminbi. Only 5.3% of the investments in 2023 were in US dollars. And that's down from 8.5% in 2022. Meanwhile, the big split is happening. Did you see the news this week? GGV has announced that they're splitting into two with totally different names. The China operations will be called Granite, Granite, and I can't remember what the US operations are going to be named, but they're splitting the assets, they're splitting the name up. Now Sequoia China is being known as Hongshan. Basically the people who are already there are having to separate China and their business from everything else that they're doing. Also, you're seeing a massive shift in what entrepreneurs are going after in China. Back in 2014, that was the year that Alibaba went public, almost all of the Chinese companies that were in the top 20 VC deals in terms of amount of money were e-commerce companies. In 2023, there were no e-commerce companies that got big funding. Instead, this is very rational. If you're thinking of starting a company in China, you go to some place that you think will be successful. So you go after manufacturing, especially advanced manufacturing, or you go after technology where the government is putting massive amounts of money into things like batteries for EVs or electric vehicles themselves. So the areas of government interest are definitely driving what people are investing in and what companies are being created. But despite this decoupling from the US, make no mistake, China is still the largest startup ecosystem in Asia. This next slide over here on the bottom right of the picture, China accounted for 18% of all of the venture capital funding in the world in January of 2023. And it accounted for 18.9% of all of the venture capital funding in the world that month in January of 2024. So even though the number of deals is going down and you're seeing this kind of shift, it's a big system and it's not going to get smaller. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we proceed. So if you ask what's going on in Japan, why didn't Japan have that big drop? You're looking at the results of an amazing amount of money being spent and regulations being passed by the Japanese government to grow the startup ecosystem. They came out with this startup development 5-year plan in 2022 that aims to increase the amount of venture capital funding in Japan by 10 times over a period of really 5 years. So from 6 billion a year, which already is considerably higher than it was, 10 or 15 years ago, they're aiming at $60 billion of venture capital funding in the year 2027. They're really pushing entrepreneurs in Japan to try to get money from the foreign venture investors. The Japanese government has just funded an innovation campus here in Silicon Valley, kind of diagonally across the street from Whole Foods Market in Palo Alto. And they have 52 Japanese companies that have been approved to go through their program over there. Current companies are doing things like IPS, stem cell therapy for heart patients. Or there's several in the robotic space. There's a company that's developing large language models. in this incubator now. So there are also other things we're trying to make it easier for other kinds of investment to happen. A lot of the Japanese kind of startup community has been very heavily technology intensive and takes a long time to get to market, especially if you're in, some medical area like IPS. So they're making it easier for the banks to take equity positions in these companies, even if they're startup companies that are more than 10 years old. That used to be kind of restricted. And so you see these things in Japan that you see here too, but they're kind of unusual. You don't see them many other places in Asia. Fusion energy. Startup companies on fusion energy in Japan. And other kinds of high tech. What I'm not sure I really think is going to have a good impact is this one that just came out a couple of weeks ago, I guess 6 weeks ago now. There's new legislation that will allow venture investors to buy crypto assets. So instead of selling stock in your company, you can sell NFTs or something to your investors, or whatever coin to your investors, which of course comes with different legal kind of standing than if you actually own shares in the company. They're really pushing it. The other thing to note about Japan that is kind of distinctive is that there's really two areas. Japan's sense of the big problems. So some are big social problems, like the aging population and shortage of labor force. That's driven an awful lot of medical devices, medical services, robotics, automation, self-driving cars, that kind of thing. That is kind of in the heart of the Japanese startup ecosystem. One specific thing that I noticed in the news was how hot the people who are making anime are about using generative AI to lower their production cost. So we worry about that in Hollywood, but a lot of the production of something like anime probably could be automated without a whole lot of people being worried. Anyway, that's the thing that came out. And you get things like climate tech and space industries that are also big topics in Japan. We'll address some of these later. Another distinctive thing about the Japanese system is the amount of corporate venture capital that is flowing in Japan. You can tell from the size of the bubbles that Japan is the next biggest to the United States, and this is absolute terms. This is not in terms of, per population or whatever. About 30% of all of the limited partners in all of the venture capital companies in Japan are corporates, meaning operating companies. And they have some strategic interest in finding out about particular startups or finding out about particular emerging markets. They care about things in addition to financial return. The equivalent number in the US and in other Asian markets is 10 to 11%. I saw some concern that Thailand has too many CVC in the Thai venture capital ecosystem, and it was 11%. So, this is one of those things that is distinctive about Japan. A data point that I didn't put in these slides, the Japan External Trade Office, JETRO, did a 5-year survey of corporate venture capital by Japanese companies. And the amount of corporate venture capital invested every year in Silicon Valley during that 5-year period was equivalent to the entire venture capital investments in all of Japan. About $5 or $6 billion every year went into CVC investments here in the Valley. So last few points about capital flow. Go ahead.
Question on the previous slide, what are the other factors that these corporates would care about outside of financial returns then?
Possible business relationships. You know, if this is somebody that can help me solve a problem, I'm going to get into this a little bit. They're generally fall into the category of open innovation. So a great example was a big Japanese construction company partnered with a drone company making images here. And they were able to use that to automate their kind of mapping and replace human surveyors, because there was a huge shortage of human surveyors before the Japanese Olympics in 2021. So they invested in the company, because if they didn't invest in the US company wouldn't have had anything to do with them. By investing in the company, they reduced the fear that they were just out for their technology. And then they were able to build a business relationship with them. So you get that kind of direct thing. That's a great question. Go ahead.
I have a question regarding the CVC. What are the main goals that they're having? Is it to generate financial returns or to have more integrated products?
It depends on the CVC. So Google Ventures looks so close to a general VC, it's hard to tell the difference, even though technically they would be CVC. However, at the other end of the scale, and this is not a very successful model, I remember the head of the venture capital arm of the old Sun Microsystems, which got bought by Oracle years ago. Anyway, basically, he confided to me that we really invest in companies that are likely to buy a lot of our servers. So we give them the money, we get their stock, and they buy our servers. Okay. It was not a very successful firm. But they'll be interested in that. It's a great way to hedge risk. If you're a big company, you're going to devote most of your R&D to supporting the development of your own business. And the world is changing so rapidly that you really need to keep in touch with what's going on outside and, one, not get disrupted, right? So if you see something, even if it's not in your current area of business, maybe that will have an impact on the strategic direction of your company 5 or 10 years later. So there are a variety of things that people are looking for. Great question. Okay, we only have a few more of these slides. Global exits. So worldwide, exits happen about on a ratio of 1 to 10. One IPO for 10 times the big companies acquire the startup. But notice that in Asia, it's much less. The M&A was never more than about, 3 or 4 times more than the IPOs. And the M&A dropped like a rock during 2022, while the IPOs actually stayed relatively steady. And this is across all Asia, so it's covering a lot. What you're seeing is big companies not being sophisticated in exactly the kind of things that you asked me the question about, because you do CVC for similar reasons that you actually buy the company. The difference is you buy the company when you know you need to have that business, right? Or that technology. So that was the capital flow. I only have one slide on knowledge flow. All across Asia, there is this huge push for innovation. This has been going on for years. It is not subsiding. It's especially trying to make government-funded universities and research institutions more practical and deliver concrete output in terms of social contributions, which is great. You're getting a lot of knowledge transfer in the technology area, but what you're not getting is a lot of emphasis on how to transfer the business knowledge it takes to be successful with a startup. I cannot tell you how many startup companies with really interesting technologies I see coming in from Asian countries. And there's a bunch of scientists who haven't yet figured out that they really have to, the market is not going to do what they want it to do. They have to do what the market will accept, right? So that's part of it. Mentoring is not really that well developed in the Asian world. To some extent, that requires the kind of platonic dialogue basis for learning that is fundamental to Western society, where I may never completely agree with you, but I'm going to listen to your comments and really pay attention to what you have to say and think about the solution. In Asia, which has a more Confucian apprentice tradition, you copy the master, you copy the master, you copy the master. And then finally, when you become the master, then you can actually, do what you want to do. But by that point, you're pretty well ingrained. So I think that plus the consideration of face, the professors over here at engineering are all going out and doing consulting. They may be wrong once in a while. And nobody wants to be wrong. But in an Asian institution, the professors tend not to want to do consulting because there's no upside. They get a little bit of extra money, but if they say something that might turn out to be bad advice, how horrible. So I think that considerations of face, less confrontation in investor management relations, whereas we live on confrontation here. Although I do think that you're seeing an increase in the foreign participation in the venture ecosystems, and it's going to force startups to become more sophisticated. Just this week, I was talking with somebody who is a venture capitalist and a board director in one of the portfolio companies. And this was in Japan, they really gave the management a hard time because they didn't provide the kind of reports that they expected as a foreign and board investor. And the other thing, the last thing is really the knowledge flow between business partners needs to improve. Open innovation is not that well understood, partly because in areas like Japan and Korea, where you have high prestige companies and less mobile labor markets, there's a lot of kind of barriers to learning from the startup companies. And in a place like China, where it is much more mobile, you have less willingness to share information because the other side might take it and do something else with it. At the executive level throughout Asia, there's this whole thing about how much are you punished for missing an opportunity versus being punished for making some obvious mistake. And big companies run global operations, so they have to have pretty rigid business processes. In a startup company, we don't have time for that. So that's made it difficult to develop what really took 40 years to develop in the United States. If you go back to about 1975, in the United States, 4% of new patents were assigned to small and medium-sized companies. 90% of the patents 90% plus went to big companies. By 1995, something like 30% of all new patents were going to US startup companies. So we've had that, we've gone down this path, but several generations before. So that's our talk for today. The decline in venture funding has slowed down. Asia markets are still driving world economic growth. The world is gradually coming back after COVID. This year is the first time it really feels kind of normal again. The sense of resilience is pretty high. People beat their chests about worrying about supply chains and manufacturing, but they're adapting pretty well. And you know, the energy that we're getting from things like generative AI, of course, is keeping the whole system moving forward. With regard to people flow, I think the drop in the T rate in China is probably one of the most significant things that's going on. Overall, the increase is happening in the US. Maybe 14 or 15% is sort of one of those natural kind of levels for entrepreneurial activity within a very robust, innovation-driven economy. But it seems kind of low in China right now. And the promotion by governments of all of this new commercialization and startup companies is having a supply side effect, and the demand side is not quite there yet. So I'm hoping that the demand side, as is happening in India, where really the whole system is becoming more sophisticated and the outlook seems quite positive, you know, that's exciting to a lot of people. And I think we are going to feel the negative aspects of decoupling with China in the next few years. I'm very realistic. I'm not trying to make any kind of political statement. And the investment world, the startup world, is basically apolitical. You put your money where you can get a good return, right? And I think that there are real challenges to the situation as China develops its own sources of funding, as well as places where it wants to send the funding, and you know, moves away from going public on US markets. Yeah, we'll see some negative aspects to that, but in the best Silicon Valley tradition, there are also new opportunities. So we look around. Next week, we have the CEO of Thailand's largest business accelerator coming. He's a Stanford MBA. He's going to bring something like 12 executives from Thailand with him. So we have special networking after the session next week. And they're going to do another session in this auditorium from 7 o'clock on kind of the whole situation with startups in Southeast Asia. So that'll be fun. 2 weeks in today, Eric Zhang, who is the president of one of China's most successful startup companies. They do LED lighting for consumers. He already has 500 stores across China, and he's online, and now he's expanding into the US. You may have to set up another company. We can ask him about it. In 3 weeks, on April 23rd, we have a great panel coming in from India with one of the venture capitalists who is also in a family office in India, bringing in 3 entrepreneurs who are really exciting to talk about what's going on there. We've got artificial intelligence company from South Korea on April the 30th. I'm talking to people about putting together sessions on climate tech and space tech in Asia. And so we will continue through May. Look forward to seeing you next week. For now, though, any questions or comments? We've got a few more minutes in the class time. Go ahead.
I'm just curious, what kind of funds are qualified to enter an Asian market, and what does that process look like?
What kind of funds?
Yeah, I mean, like what kind of investors, yeah.
The larger VC funds are the likely places where you'll see it. One thing that's very interesting is the number of US VCs that take lead positions in investments in Asia has increased. And in order to take the lead position, you're responsible, primarily responsible for the due diligence. And that means that these Silicon Valley large VCs have the networks to do the investigations and to vet the companies that they're investing in. So Sequoia actually invests more outside the US than they invest in the US. You will see some specialist funds getting started up where there will be what? And Draper had a whole network. So the fund that invested in Korea was called Draper Athena. And the one that invested in Japan, ENX Ventures. And the other thing that enables this is a lot more reliance on online information. You can scrape views all over the internet and find companies in all sorts of different countries, not just down the street. Great question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned Asian entrepreneur don't get out of the I'm curious what the US entrepreneurs get as a mentoring from here and
A lot of it is from the angel investor. Remember, you don't just go to the person who has money. Go to the person who can really help you. Especially when you go to the angel, you're typically going to somebody who has great contact in the industry space you want to develop your company in, or who have some kind of experience. So angel investors are one group. I think that the way we do networking encourages people to get together, and the reason Silicon Valley networking works is people know what they can repeat to other people and what they shouldn't. That's a remarkable sophistication beyond just not taking intellectual property that we have in the Valley. And it frees up a lot of discussion that you just couldn't have without this level of sophistication. Angels are a big one. Thank you. Go ahead.
What is the current perceptions of VCs that have Chinese LPs?
Oh, you mean the dark side? Oh, that's just VCs in general.
Is
That have
correct?
Chinese LPs. Well, first of all, that's becoming more and more difficult. You know, the US has CFIUS committee, which examines any foreign investor in an American organization. And you basically have to get the government's permission to accept foreign investors into what you're doing. So I think that that's one of the reasons that the big Valley VCs are splitting off. Maybe there will be money relationships between these two firms that GGV has created, but they will put up some walls so that the group that's working outside China will be able to just have much more freedom. And the ones inside China will be focused more on the situation, but being successful. Okay, go ahead.
I have a follow-up question on that. So is there a need now for founders to conduct some certain due diligence on VCs, because the LP is not public information?
There is like a 600 item list of technologies that are subject to American export controls. And you must go through and check and see if your company would be subject to the CFIUS regulations. This is not an investment company. This is a, operating startup company. That process typically costs about $350,000. You're paying a lawyer to check this out for you. And that kind of thing is one of the disadvantages that the startup system is having to deal with. It was big news 4 or 5 years ago when it first started up. People are kind of getting used to it.
And I think the
the 5-year plan of Japanese government, like many Taiwanese startup are aiming at the Japanese market. I'm just curious about like, since CVC plays such an essential role in Japan, the growing strategy for startups who aim at the Japan market will have a different strategy from the US experiences.
It will be different, and it will be different in every Asian country. And if I can kind of use your question to be the last thing to say today. There's this huge diversity inside Asia. Different countries have very different kind of cultural frameworks. They have very different kind of expectations and of course, different regulatory frameworks as well. So yeah, it'll be very different, not just between Japan and here, but between Japan and Taiwan. And Taiwan has its own government programs that are really quite successful. That's very much the case. For this 30,000-foot view, I couldn't really get into too much of the details. But thanks to everybody. We've got some refreshments outside and we'd love to talk a little bit more and hope to see you next week. Thanks for coming.